Hello, everyone. This is Jerry. For those tuning in for the first time, I'm an autistic adult doing autism advocacy videos, and today I'm going to talk about the flaws inherent to neurodiversity theory. Now, neurodiversity theory is an example of sounds good in theory, but falls apart in practice. So I'm going to explain why that's the case, first starting with a bit of context. Now, my first initial thoughts regarding neurodiversity theory years ago when I first heard of it was, well, you had some people that took things too far, that it did kind of more good than harm overall. The reason why I believe this is partially due to my own personal experiences, as well as just recently only starting to do more of a deeper dive into what this theory actually entails. Now, when I was diagnosed in 1988, most people had either never heard of autism or had knowledge limited to narrow, often negative stereotypes that didn't apply to all autistic people. Now, much of this even applied to many in the medical field. When I was first diagnosed, it had been 8 years since the DSM 3 had been published, and it wasn't until 6 years later that the DSM 4 was published. So, according to page 100 of the DSM 3, under, quote, infantile autism, which you can read for yourself, linked in the description. Indeed, all sources I use for this video are in the description. Quote, some people believe that infantile autism is the earliest form of schizophrenia, whereas others believe that they are two distinct conditions. However, there is apparently no increased incidence of schizophrenia in the families of children with infantile autism, which supports the hypothesis that the two disorders are unrelated. You heard that right. There was an actual debate among medical professionals at that time about whether or not autism was a form of schizophrenia. While the DSM 3 stating that autism was probably not a form of schizophrenia was a profound step forward for that time, it also speaks to how much incorrect information prevailed at that time. Another inaccurate assumption followed in the sentence immediately afterwards. Quote, the failure to develop interpersonal relationships is characterized by a lack of responsiveness to and a lack of interest in people, with a concomitant failure to develop normal attachment behavior. In other words, autistic people don't make friends and don't interact in ways usually expected because they're not interested in that, which is in complete contrast to the accounts of myself and many other autistic people. Now, the DSM-3R, released in 1987, slightly revised what it referred to as infantile autism on page 7 as autistic disorder, but has otherwise left most of the information the same. It's because of these and other misconceptions that the doctor who diagnosed me had a very pessimistic outlook on my future, so much that he recommended institutionalizing me. Now, while my sensory issues, linguistic delays, and emotional regulation issues were quite serious at that time, my parents sought a second and likely other opinions and were able to get me into a good program at UCSD, which used methods which were considered experimental at the time but would help form the basis of early intervention therapies. It's in large part thanks to these therapies that I've enjoyed the degree of success that I have, despite still having many struggles. Now, this, along with the continued misconceptions I've noticed many people had about autism, is what initially made neurodiversity, at least at first, appeal to me. I never believed, and still don't believe now, that autism is always an automatic death sentence, but that was the prevailing opinion through most of my childhood, though it was one that's just starting to be challenged. I also understood that there were severe cases of autism because I'd seen examples of those cases in my personal life through people I knew. In other words, I saw the complete lack of nuance in the old view and thought there needed to be a change. I decided that when I began speaking in conferences during my teen years, as well as during the many years I made autism advocacy videos, first starting in my early 20s, that I would mostly focus on what I saw as a hopeful message. I thought since most people understood that autism commonly came with negative traits, that there was no need to focus too much on that. That I needed to give parents and loved ones, as well as other autistic people, that they weren't alone, that most of them could be successful, much like Temple Grandin, did in her early days. and really still does to this very day. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but now looking back, that instead of the nuance I thought I was providing, I was in some case inadvertently taking part in an overcorrection from the old view, even though I was far from the worst offender. If you asked me 5 or 6 years ago whether or not autism was a disability or disorder, my answer would have been that it depended on where someone was on the spectrum. My answer now, however, would be, even in most high-functioning cases, including my own, would be yes. And it's for the simple reason, which I'll probably go more into in part 2, that anything that requires accommodation can reasonably be called an impairment, even in cases where it also accompanied by some positive traits. As I pointed out in another video I made roughly half a year ago in response to bad actors in and out of the autism and LGBT communities falsely conflating the two communities for partisan political reasons, autism advocacy had become too political, and one example of this I gave was neurodiversity advocates slandering my own mother, who had been there for me since day one, and still is an ableist supposedly because she said something that contradicted their dogma, and said I had internalized ableism for defending my own mother from these baseless accusations. The encounter, while it occurred years ago, left a bad taste in my mouth. Throughout those years, I kept seeing the worsening patterns. I saw individuals as well as, more disturbingly, advocacy organizations lose their collective minds, embracing an increasingly toxic ideology which I saw as having zero basis in reality and ultimately doing more harm than good. That video was the first opening salvo in my critiques of this disastrous trend, but wasn't my last, as a few months later I made a video criticizing the self-diagnosis trend, which the slippery slope created by neurodiversity theory has allowed to happen. In response to my video, I interacted with various other autistic people. Some supported self-diagnosis as being necessary and insisted my early diagnosis was because I had privilege, while none of them knew or understood that I got this early diagnosis in the first place because my case really was that obvious. I never disputed, or do now, that the system has problems, or that there are unethical doctors that have taken advantage of people, but only that such a thing was not a solution to any of it. I also interacted with various autistic people who actually agreed with many of my critiques. Many of these autistic people expressed a sense of alienation from many mainstream autism advocacy groups and activists because they felt neurodiversity movements' single-minded embrace of the social model of disability trivialized their struggles, and the negative reactions to these concerns shut them out of a movement that was supposed to help them. Some of these critics referred to themselves as being, and I'm paraphrasing due to minimizing profanity in these videos to reach a general audience, neuro-screwed. While I've come to the conclusion that I'm not as well integrated into society as I'd originally thought due to my struggles with autistic burnout and monotropism, for example, which are both topics I plan to release videos for in the near future, I wouldn't describe myself in such a manner, but do understand why some higher support needs autistic people would wish to describe themselves in such a way. Despite my embrace of this term to describe myself, I still feel that I relate to them far better than I relate to most supporters of neurodiversity theory. Like them, I feel alienated from many mainstream autism advocacy groups, that my own concerns are being dismissed, that my seat at the table is being taken from me by people I feel I have practically nothing in common with, or ill-defined goals that make no sense to me. This begs the question of how could such a thing happen? This is where a much-needed history lesson comes in. The term neurodiversity was first coined by Australian sociologist Judy Singer in an academic paper she wrote in the late 90s during her undergraduate study called Odd People and the Birth of Community and Autistic People. I was hoping to quote some passages in that work for this video, but have unfortunately not been able to find a copy of this. Singer later published a book based on these ideas, though I prefer to not give her any of my money. In this paper, as well as much of the work throughout her career, Singer rejected the medical model of disability in favor of the social model. The medical model is the one most people are familiar with. That conditions medically framed as disabilities disorders, such as autism, are conditions to, if not be cured, at least treated. The social model, on the other hand, stipulates that conditions such as autism are not disabilities or disorders to be treated or cured, but are mere differences in brain function, or that if a disability is present, it is due to a lack of accommodation. In other words, that the negative aspects attributed to these disorders are not due to the conditions themselves, but are due primarily to how society views them and treats people with those conditions. Or that these negative traits are not due to the condition itself, but due to comorbidities, which makes no sense when you consider the numerous potential comorbidities that exist within autism. The term was popularized by journalist Harvey Bloom in a September 1998 article in The Atlantic. In his article, Bloom argued that the rise of, quote, geek culture, thanks in large part to the rise of tech jobs, thanks to the internet and other technological advances, have given autistic people a refuge from a world which often penalizes their neurological differences. Bloom asked the question, who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any given moment, and claims that tech jobs, quote, may favor a somewhat autistic cast of mind. With autism being a spectrum, this begs the important question of what kind of case of autistic mind, one which the article not only fails to answer but doesn't even bother to acknowledge. Neurodiversity gives lip service to a spectrum, yet primarily focuses on the higher end of it, while pretending the more severe cases don't exist, which shuts out the most vulnerable in the autism community out of the conversation as part of some de facto social gentrification, while at the same time also failing to acknowledge struggles present within those higher on the spectrum as well. These ideas were around before the term was officially coined, though. A key example being a 1993 speech at an autism conference in Toronto, Canada by Jim Sinclair, who's often credited with founding the autism rights movement, called Don't Mourn for Us. In this speech, Sinclair argues that autism itself is not a death sentence to be mourned over. While not every case of autism is a lost cause, indeed I believe most of them are not, the problem with Sinclair's speech is that there is little to no acknowledgement of the more severe cases, which indeed are actual tragedies. Simply put, like the old view Sinclair attempted to counter, it completely lacks any kind of nuance and worse. Still, like refrigerator mother hypothesis once did in the 1950s and 60s, attempts to scapegoat parents concerned about the well-being of their autistic children. This sentence especially comes off as particularly callous to me. When parents say, I wish my child did not have autism, what they're really saying is, I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different, non-autistic child instead. Imagine being a parent at this conference, likely knowing very little about autism in the days before the internet was a thing in most people's lives, and having many fears and concerns about your child's well-being and future, and instead of compassion and reassurance, you are met with blatant gaslighting and are scapegoated as the problem. While there are some parents indeed as bad as Sinclair described, such as this one mother in an Autism Speaks documentary who said in front of her autistic daughter that she contemplated driving them both off a bridge, to overly generalize in such an irresponsible manner which doesn't apply to the majority is unconscionable. On the other one hand, an autistic person speaking in front of you, something you may not have realized was possible, something your child's doctor might not have even realized was possible, yet you, the parent, are shamed for having a completely normal reaction to what can often seem like a hopeless situation. Sinclair is correct that autism is not always an automatic death sentence, but in his speech he has replaced one form of dogma with another. As an autistic person, Sinclair should have known better, but the same can be said for many others as well. I don't know if the person who made this particular post I'm showing on screen now is autistic, but has some other condition, or is simply self-diagnosed. But I've seen some other autistic people ironically make posts similar to it. According to this post, disorders are only called disorders because they're created by capitalism. Now, once again, going back to Judy Singer, she echoes this statement in another tweet claiming that disability itself is some form of capitalist conspiracy to separate the worthy and unworthy poor. This being a contradiction to a prior post where she argues that disability is not a dirty word and that her theories are rooted in the disability rights movement. which clearly indicates that she has no principles to speak of whatsoever. While such a contradiction seems nonsensical indeed is, the dueling narratives make more sense when you consider the fact that Singer described neurodiversity as, quote, the last great identity politics movement of the 20th century. In other words, what is important to Singer isn't autism advocacy or education, but plain and simple grifting and opportunism. In an interview with Psychology Today last year, Singer claimed that it was very clear in my thesis that I was only talking about Asperger's, yet claims she has not corrected, she has not corrected this due to fears of trolls. Even if we say for the sake of argument this is true, what was once called Asperger's itself also ranges in severity, with some being considered level 2 or moderate support needs, or level 1 low support needs by current criteria, which still calls her theories into question despite the flaws inherent in the numbering system. Instead of perhaps admitting that the coinage of the term neurodiversity might have been a mistake, she claims that it has been distorted from her original intent and has now coined the term neurorealism to allegedly meet people's needs, regardless of whether they consider themselves as disabled or different. Though this new term seems conspicuously absent from Singer's Twitter page for some reason. Whether intended or not, her theories have led to vacuous garbage such as the tweet from Little Miss It's Capitalism's fall to the tweet that is arguably racist and homophobic from the founder of the San Francisco-based so-called autism advocacy organization Pivot Neurodiversity, as well as this pseudo-intellectual claptrap of a so-called meme, which in a nutshell says it's society's fault. This brings me back to the article I mentioned in the LGBT video that said there were too many white gay men in the movement. If identity politics is first and foremost the motivation for something, then the people it is supposed to speak for will eventually be forced out by ideologues and grifters with zero actual concern for them. This has gotten so out of hand that an actual doctor has made posts on social media about how PTSD is supposedly not a mental disorder, as in the same disorder that has taken the lives of millions of people, including someone I know personally. Because apparently the stress responses are supposedly normal, even though all evidence points to this being an abnormality, because the stress response, which normally abates after the crisis is over, never completely goes away in PTSD. Even if you could make the case of it being normal, normal does not always mean optimal. This doctor does make a valid point about PTSD responses occurring during ongoing trauma, but it doesn't save the argument from not only being inaccurate, but outright dangerous. There are many trauma responses common to PTSD, and some of them can pose a danger to the victim as well as those around them. Violence, for example, is a common response to some PTSD triggers in some people. Is that a trauma response we should validate? Unless you've completely lost your mind, I would assume your answer would be no. But why the overcorrection? It's partially because having a condition like autism often makes someone a social outcast, in large part through no fault of their own. This is partially due to social cue interpretation difficulties, resulting in various misunderstandings stemming from double empathy problem. In other words, autistic people and others have trouble communicating to one another due to communication differences due to having different neurotypes. This results in, as well as contributes to, bullying and discrimination autistic people commonly face. This often breeds resentment, such as the kind expressed in Sinclair's speech, which is further compounded by often outdated perceptions also contributing to this. This resentment doesn't erase the desire of community and belonging, which most autistic people still have, despite the different ways in which this is expressed has resulted in us creating our own spaces. Unfortunately, this mishandled resentment has seeped into not all but far too many of these spaces. This same resentment can often leave people, regardless of their neurological condition, vulnerable to radicalism. This is where neurodiversity theory comes in. Like a religion, it has a creed, albeit one that has changed slightly over the years with the development of it, though the same could be said of religion. I bring this up not to be disrespectful towards religious people or to somehow criticize religion, but make this comparison because extreme ideologies like fundamentalist religious interpretations are a corruption of the psychological needs of community and purpose. If an autistic person or someone else with another neurological condition truly feels that they don't belong anywhere else or aren't accepted anywhere else, then they can join a community which, at least in theory, is accepting of them. This also partially explains, as I've said in the LGBT video, the attempts to arbitrarily link autism and LGBT communities. Neurodiversity itself is yet another metastasization of the malignant tumor that is intersectionality. As I've said before, because this hasn't fulfilled these needs among many other autistic people that don't blindly follow this creed, it's resulted in the autism community not being at war with itself more than it has ever been. Add the self-diagnosis trend, which is perhaps being encouraged by many supporters of neurodiversity theory in part as a cynical recruitment tool, and you have a movement threatening to undermine itself at nearly every turn after decades of crucial progress that is now under threat of reversing. Of course, this begs another important question of exactly what is the solution to this problem. The answer to that is best saved for part 2, and I'll see you there.